The elite diners at the Manhattan Steakhouse couldn't stop staring at the quiet woman and the stone-faced man beside her. No one could communicate with them. No one would offer a helping hand. And no one realized, they were looking at the mother and the hand-picked heir of the most feared syndicate in Seoul. The dining room of the elite Manhattan establishment buzzed with the sound of clinking crystal and the soft hum of high-stakes power plays. Men in $5,000 suits and women draped in diamonds carried themselves with the effortless ease of those who own the world. But at a central table, a different kind of power sat in heavy silence. Gyo Min-Jung sat elegantly, her posture composed but her frame tense with a growing, quiet vulnerability. Beside her sat Cha Jin-Ho, serious, observant, and wrapped in a formal dark suit that signaled a lethal level of importance. They were untouchable in their own world, but here, the problem was just beginning. When the waiter presented the menu, the air at the table shifted from intimidating to frustrating. Min-Jung's eyes searched the English text, her confusion deepening as she tried to explain a specific traditional request. She tried to form the words. But the staff's faces only tightened with growing impatience. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The wealthy guests at nearby tables began to notice the delay. Some exchanged annoyed glances. Others whispered about unrefined guests. A few even smirked at the woman's inability to speak the language of the room. The restaurant was watching a woman who commands respect across oceans shrink under the weight of social apathy. What the staff and the smirking diners didn't know was that the man whose mother they were judging was losing his patience. And the entire room was 1 minute away from a disaster. Until a black waitress named Kathleen R. Abraham stepped out of the shadows and did the one thing no one expected. The heavy glass doors of the establishment swung open, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, as if the air itself had been sucked out to make room for something colder. At the center of this sudden gravity was Cha Jin-Ho. He moved with a predatory grace, his presence a dark contrast to the warm, golden glow of the crystal chandeliers. His suit was a midnight black, tailored so sharply it seemed to cut through the light, and his eyes, calm, observant, and entirely unreadable, scanned the room not with curiosity, but with the cold calculation of a man who owned everything he looked at. Beside him walked Gyo Min-Jung. She was a vision of quiet, traditional elegance, her back straight and her gaze soft but steady. She wore a deep charcoal hanbok-style dress that whispered against the marble floor, a garment that spoke of a different world and a different kind of power, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. As they were led to a central table, the hum of high society chatter faltered. Wealthy diners paused with forks halfway to their mouths, their eyes darting between the intimidating man and the serene woman at his side. Jin-Ho pulled out a chair for his mother with a gesture of profound, protective reverence, a brief glimpse of the devotion hidden beneath his lethal exterior. Once she was seated, he took his place beside her, his body angled slightly toward her like a shield. The surrounding guests felt the weight of their arrival. It was as if a piece of the Seoul underworld had been dropped into the heart of Manhattan's elite circle. The waitstaff hovered at a distance, paralyzed by the sheer intensity of Jin-Ho's silence. He didn't look at the wine list or the decor. His focus remained entirely on his mother's comfort, ensuring her water was poured and her napkins were placed just so. For Min-Jung, the room was a beautiful but alien landscape, lion's den of foreign tongues and unfamiliar customs. She offered a small, appreciative smile to her son, a private moment of warmth in a room full of staring strangers. But as the lead waiter finally approached, clutching a menu like a peace offering, the first cracks of the language barrier began to show. Min-Jung looked up, her expression one of polite readiness, yet the English-only world was already closing in. The silence at the table was no longer just about power, it was about the beginning of a struggle that the rest of the room was all too eager to watch. In this den of lions, the Empress of Seoul was about to find herself without a voice, and the man beside her was already feeling the first spark of a dangerous, protective fire. The velvet-bound menu felt like a lead weight in Gyo Min-Jung's hands. As she opened it, the elegant gold-leafed pages revealed a dense thicket of English text, the sprawling descriptions of artisanal courses blurring into a meaningless maze of ink. She had navigated the complex politics of Seoul's most powerful families for decades, yet here, under the watchful gaze of Manhattan's elite, she felt a sudden, sharp pang of exposure. The silence at the table began to stretch, turning from a sign of power into a heavy, suffocating shroud. Beside her, Cha Jin-Ho remained a statue of dark tailored wool, but his eyes were beginning to narrow. He could feel the shift in the room's energy. To his left, a waiter stood with his weight shifted slightly to one foot, his chin tilted at an angle that bordered on condescension. The man's eyes flickered to his watch, a subtle, jagged movement that did not escape Jin-Ho's notice. To the waiter, they were merely a wealthy inconvenience, a pair of foreigners stalling his rotation in a room that demanded efficiency. Min-Jung cleared her throat, her voice a soft, melodic rasp as she attempted to bridge the gap. She pointed to a line on the menu, trying to ask about a specific preparation, a dietary necessity she had maintained for years. "This, is it, no salt?" she whispered, her English brittle and hesitant. The waiter leaned in, not with the grace of service, but with the impatience of a teacher dealing with a slow student. "It's a reduction, ma'am." "A red wine reduction with a clarified base," he replied, his words clipped and fast, intentionally complex. He didn't slow down. He didn't try to simplify. He spoke over her, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by the neighboring tables. Min-Jung's hands trembled. She looked at the words again, but they offered no sanctuary. She tried once more, her Korean instincts momentarily overriding her English practice as she gestured toward a side dish, her face flushing with a rare, painful heat. The waiter let out a breath, a sound that was almost a sigh, and looked toward the ceiling as if seeking patience from the gods of fine dining. Nearby, a couple in evening wear traded a smirk behind their wine glasses, their hushed laughter cutting through the air like a blade. The restaurant, once a place of luxury, had transformed into a battlefield where language was the only weapon that mattered, and Min-Jung was standing unarmed. Jin-Ho's hand moved, his fingers curling into a slow, deliberate fist upon the white linen tablecloth. The protective fire in his chest was no longer a spark, it was a roaring flame. He didn't need to understand the menu to understand the insult, and as he turned his cold, lethal gaze toward the waiter, the very air in the lion's den began to turn frigid. The air in the dining room, once thick with the scent of expensive truffle and aged wine, now felt sharp with the sting of social judgment. As Gyo Min-Jung lowered her head, her eyes fixed on the indecipherable menu, the surrounding tables seemed to lean in, drawn by the scent of a weakness they could finally exploit. To the wealthy elite surrounding her, her silent struggle was no longer a mystery to be respected, it was a performance for their amusement. A woman 3 tables away, draped in pearls that caught the light like cold eyes, leaned toward her husband. She didn't bother to lower her voice. "It's fascinating, isn't it?" she murmured, her tone dripping with a polished cruelty. "All that money, and she can't even order a simple piece of fish. You'd think they'd learn the language before trying to dine at a place like this." Her husband chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that echoed against the marble. "Some things simply can't be bought, darling. Class involves communication." The whispers began to ripple outward like a poisonous tide. A group of young executives in the corner traded sharp glances, their smirks widening as they watched the waiter's exaggerated display of patience. They saw a woman who appeared diminished, a foreigner, who had dared to step into their world without the proper credentials of speech. The quiet dignity she had walked in with was being picked apart, replaced by the labels of unrefined and out of place. Min-Jung could feel the weight of their collective gaze. It was a heat that had nothing to do with the kitchen, a burning shame that made the fine silk of her dress feel like sandpaper against her skin. Every muffled laugh from a nearby table felt like a physical blow. She was a woman who had raised a lion, who had survived the harshest winters of Seoul's underworld, yet here, under the soft glow of Manhattan crystal, she felt smaller than she ever had. Beside her, Cha Jin-Ho was no longer just a shield, He was a coiled spring. His jaw was set so tight that a muscle jumped in his cheek, his gaze fixed forward with a terrifying, frozen intensity. He didn't need to understand every English word to recognize the cadence of mockery. He heard the jagged edges of their laughter and the condescending lilt of their voices. His hand, resting on the table, began to grip the edge of the mahogany until his knuckles turned a ghostly white. The elite of New York were laughing at the woman who had given him life, and the silence at their table was becoming a countdown. The room was full of people who thought they were superior, unaware that they were mocking the mother of a man who dealt in consequences. The sound of their whispering was the sound of a fuse burning down, and the explosion was only moments away. Kathleen stood in the shadows near the service station, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture a perfect mask of professional invisibility. To the manager and the high-paying regulars, she was just another part of the decor, a girl who cleared plates and kept the water glasses filled without being noticed. But behind her calm, dark eyes, Kathleen saw everything. She heard the jagged rhythm of the whispers from the elite tables and felt the rising heat of the mockery that filled the room. Most of all, she saw the woman at the center of the storm. While the other servers saw a difficult customer or an unrefined foreigner, Kathleen saw someone who looked exactly like her own grandmother. She saw the way Gyo Min-Jung's fingers tightened on the silk of her dress, a silent signal of distress that Kathleen knew by heart. Kathleen had grown up in a house where two worlds collided. Her father had been a soldier stationed in Seoul, and her mother had made sure their home in Brooklyn was filled with the scents of ginger and sesame and the melodic rise and fall of the Korean language. Kathleen hadn't just learned the words, she had learned the soul behind them, the nuances of respect, the jong that connected people, and the quiet dignity of the elders. She watched as the lead waiter rolled his eyes, a gesture of blatant disrespect that made Kathleen's blood simmer. She saw Cha Jin-Ho's hand move toward the inside of his jacket, his eyes turning into shards of ice. The air was thick with a danger that only she seemed to recognize. The restaurant was a powder keg of cultural arrogance and mafia pride, and the fuse was burning dangerously short. Kathleen shifted her weight, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her manager had already warned her twice that week about staying in her lane and not interacting with the VIP guests beyond her station. To step forward now was to risk the only paycheck that kept her in her evening classes. But as she heard another burst of muffled laughter from the pearl-draped woman nearby, Kathleen felt a different kind of obligation, a loyalty to the language she had mastered and the respect she knew the elderly woman deserved. She wasn't just a waitress in that moment, she was the only bridge in a room full of walls. She adjusted her apron, took a deep, steadying breath, and began to move out of the shadows. She didn't walk like a servant. She walked like someone who held the key to the silence, her eyes fixed not on the menacing son or the impatient waiter, but on the vulnerable woman who was waiting for a single person to understand her. The atmosphere at the table had reached a point of no return. The lead waiter, emboldened by the silent approval of the smirking diners, leaned down one last time, his voice carrying a jagged, condescending edge. "Ma'am, I really must insist you make a selection. There are other guests waiting, and if you cannot understand the menu, perhaps a more casual establishment would suit your needs." The insult hung in the air, cold and unmistakable. For Gyo Min-Jung, it was the final blow. She lowered her gaze, her shoulders trembling almost imperceptibly as she pulled her hands back from the table, tucking them into the folds of her charcoal dress. The elegance she had maintained like armor was finally cracking, leaving only the raw vulnerability of a mother who felt she had shamed her son in public. Beside her, Cha Jin-Ho went perfectly still. The muscle in his jaw stopped jumping, replaced by a terrifying, hollow calm. He slowly turned his head toward the waiter, his eyes devoid of any human warmth, resembling the black, bottomless depths of a winter sea. His right hand, large and scarred, moved from the linen tablecloth and began to close into a slow, rhythmic fist. The sound of the fabric straining under his grip was like a warning shot. He didn't need to speak English to know his mother had been humiliated. He began to rise, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like a blade on a whetstone, his hand reaching toward the dark line of his blazer. In the shadows, Kathleen saw the movement. She saw the lethal intent in the young man's eyes and the devastating heartbreak on the mother's face. She knew that in 10 seconds, this room of crystal and pearls would be shattered by a violence it couldn't comprehend. The manager's hand caught Kathleen's arm as she stepped forward, his grip tight and his voice a panicked whisper. "Abraham, stay back. Security is on their way to escort them out. Don't get involved." Kathleen didn't blink. She didn't even look at him. With a strength born of pure conviction, she wrenched her arm free. "They don't need security," she said, her voice low and steady. "They need to be heard." She broke into the light, moving with a focused, assertive grace that cut through the tension of the room. She didn't scurry, she commanded the space, stepping directly between the towering, enraged Jin-Ho and the trembling waiter. The diners gasped, their whispers dying in their throats as they watched the junior waitress, the one they had ignored all night, place herself in the center of the Mafia strike zone. Kathleen ignored the waiter, ignored the manager, and ignored the staring crowd. She leaned forward, placing one hand firmly and respectfully on the table, and looked Gyo Min-Jung directly in the eyes. The fire of the lion's den met the calm of the bridge. The silence at the table was no longer empty, it was a pressurized chamber, seconds away from shattered glass and spilled blood. Cha Jin-Ho was halfway out of his seat, his hand disappearing into the shadow of his blazer, his eyes locked onto the trembling waiter with a lethal, focused intent. The elite diners held their breath, sensing the shift from social awkwardness to primal danger. But before the friction could ignite, a voice cut through the tension, not with the sharp edge of English, but with the soft, honorific lilt of a homeland thousands of miles away. "Eomonim," Kathleen said, her voice steady and low, using the respectful term for mother that carried the weight of 1,000 years of tradition. "Gwenchunusio." The effect was instantaneous. Jin-Ho froze, his fingers pausing against the cold steel hidden beneath his coat. Gyo Min-Jung's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sudden, piercing hope. She looked at the young black woman standing before her, a woman who wore the uniform of a world that had just rejected her, and heard the unmistakable sounds of her own heart. Kathleen didn't wait for the room to recover. She ignored the manager's muffled protests and the waiter's slack-jawed confusion. She leaned in closer, her expression shifting into one of protective warmth. In fluent, flawless Korean, she continued, "Please forgive the delay. This menu does not do justice to what you are looking for. You were asking about the seasoning, weren't you? You need something prepared with care, without the heavy salts of this kitchen." Min-Jung's breath hitched, a single tear escaping to track through the fine lines of her cheek. It wasn't just the words. It was the jong. The deep, emotional connection of being seen. The barrier that had made her feel small and invisible evaporated. She reached out, her trembling hand momentarily covering Kathleen's on the table. You speak the language of my soul," she whispered back in Korean, her voice thick with emotion. Jin-Ho slowly sank back into his chair, his hand emerging from his jacket empty. The lethal mask didn't vanish, but it softened as he looked at Kathleen with a profound, newfound intensity. He recognized the courage it took for a servant to defy her masters to protect his mother's dignity. The rest of the restaurant watched in stunned, uncomfortable silence. The whispers of mockery died away, replaced by a confused awe. The girl they had treated as part of the furniture was now the only person in the room with the power to bridge two worlds. Kathleen stood tall, her hands still anchored to the table, a black waitress in Manhattan speaking the ancient tongue of Seoul, reclaiming the dignity of a woman the world had tried to silence. The battlefield of the menu was gone, in its place, a bridge had been built from across the ocean. The manager stood frozen, his hands still half extended as if to pull Kathleen back, but the air in the room had already crystallized into a new reality. The power dynamic that had governed the restaurant for hours, the hierarchy of wealth over service, of English over the foreign, shattered in an instant. Kathleen did not look back at her boss. She did not look at the elite diners who were now leaning forward in stunned curiosity. She remained anchored to the table, her presence expanding until she was the most significant person in the room. With a graceful, authoritative movement, Kathleen reached out and gently took the heavy menu from Gyo Min-Jung's trembling hands. She set it aside on the white linen, dismissing it as the inadequate tool it was. "We don't need this," she said in Korean, her voice carrying a calm resonance that acted as a balm to the elderly woman's frayed nerves. Kathleen then turned her gaze to the lead waiter, who was still blinking in confusion. She didn't speak to him as a subordinate. She spoke as the commander of the encounter. "Bring a pot of barley tea immediately," Kathleen directed in English, her tone crisp and brooking no argument. "Then, tell the chef that Mrs. Gyo requires a poached sea bass, seasoned only with ginger and scallion. No butter, no reduction, no salt. And fetch a side of steamed white rice, the short grain from the reserve larder. Move." The waiter, stripped of his arrogance by the sheer force of her confidence, stammered a quick, "Yes, ma'am," and retreated toward the kitchen with a haste he hadn't shown all night. The manager, seeing the way the Mafia boss was now watching Kathleen, not with a threat of violence, but with a look of profound, startled respect, decided to stay silent and vanished into the shadows. A heavy, respectful hush fell over the surrounding tables. The woman in the pearls lowered her eyes, suddenly embarrassed by her own earlier mockery, while the young executives turned away, unable to meet the steady gaze of the waitress they had so recently dismissed. Kathleen had effectively silenced the room, not through fear, but through the display of a skill they couldn't buy and a dignity they had failed to practice. She leaned back slightly, giving the family their space while remaining close enough to signal her protection. Cha Jin-Ho watched her every move. He saw the way his mother's breathing had leveled out, the way the tension had left her shoulders the moment Kathleen took charge. He realized that this woman, who wore a polyester uniform and earned an hourly wage, possessed a spirit that even his vast resources couldn't command. In this high-society den of lions, the waitress had become the protector, and the most powerful man in Korea found himself following her lead. The shift was absolute. The restaurant was no longer a place of judgment, but a stage for Kathleen's quiet, linguistic revolution. The tension that had gripped the table for the last hour finally dissolved, replaced by a profound, reverent stillness as the barley tea arrived. The steam rose in delicate curls, carrying a nutty aroma that seemed to ground the group in a shared moment of peace. Kathleen poured the tea with practiced precision, her movements echoing the traditional etiquette she had learned at her mother's side. As she filled Gyo Min-Jung's cup, the elderly woman looked up, the moisture in her eyes now reflecting gratitude rather than shame. Cha Jin-Ho watched this exchange, his hands finally resting flat on the table, the lethal coil in his shoulders beginning to unwind. He watched Kathleen not as a servant, but as a person who had achieved what his wealth and violence never could. She had restored his mother's spirit. When Kathleen moved to step back and return to her station, Jin-Ho made a slight, sharp gesture with his hand. It wasn't a command, it was a request for her to stay. "Wait," he said. His English was accented but heavy with the weight of a man whose word was law. He looked at his mother, who nodded slowly, her hand still resting near Kathleen's. Jin-Ho then turned his gaze back to Kathleen, his dark eyes searching hers. "You did not just bring food," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quieted room. "You brought my mother back to me in a place that tried to make her small." He reached into the breast pocket of his blazer, but instead of the cold steel the room had feared earlier, he produced a heavy, ivory-colored card with a simple gold emblem. He didn't offer it with the flippant gesture of a tipper. He held it out with both hands, a formal sign of respect in Korean culture. "My family does not forget a debt of heart," he whispered, his intensity narrowing the world down to just the three of them. "You are wasting your gift in this room of ghosts. My mother sees a daughter in you, and I see a bridge that must be built." Min-Jung reached out, her fingers brushing Kathleen's arm once more. "The world is very loud, Kathleen," she said in Korean, her voice now steady and melodic. But you have the rare power to make it understand. If you wish to use your voice for more than just menus, our door is open. Education, travel, a seat at our table, consider it a promise. Kathleen felt a lump form in her throat, the weight of the card in her hand feeling heavier than any tray she had ever carried. In the background, the elite diners continued to watch, but they were no longer part of the story. Between a black waitress from Brooklyn and the most powerful family in Seoul, a silent pact had been forged over a simple cup of tea, a promise that the girl who had spent her life in the shadows was finally being called into the light. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant finally closed behind Kathleen for the last time, but the world she stepped into was no longer the one she had known. The ivory card tucked into her palm had been more than a gesture of gratitude. It was a key to a life she had once only dared to imagine while clearing tables in the shadows. Within months, the sponsorship promised by Gyo Min-Jung transformed from a quiet vow into a whirlwind of opportunity. Kathleen found herself trading her polyester apron for the refined halls of a prestigious international university, her days no longer spent dodging the impatient sighs of elite diners, but mastering the intricate dance of global diplomacy. The Mafia boss had kept his word with the same lethal precision he applied to his business. Cha Jin-Ho ensured that Kathleen had access to the finest mentors, yet it was Min-Jung who provided the true education. During long summers spent in Seoul, Kathleen sat at the matriarch's side, learning that power was not just about commanding a room, but about understanding the unspoken needs of those within it. She became the bridge they had discussed over that first cup of barley tea, a woman who could navigate the grit of Brooklyn and the grace of the Blue House with equal ease. Years passed, and the junior waitress who had once been warned to stay in her lane, became a woman who defined the path for others. Kathleen rose through the ranks of international relations, eventually standing on global stages as a high-level liaison. She was the one world leaders turned to when communication broke down, her voice a steadying force that could translate not just words, but intent and dignity. She became a symbol of a new legacy, one where heritage was a superpower and empathy was the highest form of intelligence. Whenever she felt the weight of her responsibilities, Kathleen would touch the small gold emblem she still carried, a reminder of the night the Empress of Seoul had found her voice through a stranger's kindness. She often thought back to that Manhattan steakhouse, to the smirks of the guests and the coldness of the chandeliers. She realized then that her transformation hadn't begun when she received the scholarship, but the moment she chose to speak up when everyone else chose silence. Kathleen R. Abraham was no longer the girl in the shadows, she was the light itself, proving to the world that the most powerful thing a person can do is ensure that no one else ever feels misunderstood.